Welcome back. This time I'm taking on a pretty atypical hobby project, a custom fungoid Tau auxiliary unit, inspired by this particular Warhammer 40k artwork. So let's begin. Here are the models I'm starting from. These neat fungoid bodies were purchased off of Etsy. Unfortunately, the store they were purchased from no longer sells them, but I've been told you can find these models from other sellers. And while some of the models have facial features, I've opted to use this one here, the one overloaded with mushroom caps, as it feels to me to be the most alien. So here's the plan. First, remove the arms using a hobby saw, which has already been done. Then, using green stuff and a few pins, I'm going to graft on some extra Tau weapons and doodads, aiming for a result evocative of the target art. These are the parts I'm planning to use. A few rail rifles as the primary weapons, some spare Space Marine cabling bits from the Aggressors and Centurions kits, and some random Tau parts. Unfortunately, I couldn't identify these parts for you if I wanted to. But before the real work begins, there's a problem I need to address. Because this model is hollow, there is no material to pin into, so the first step is some crude green stuff work. Really just packing it in there to create a dense material I can pin into later. Once it's filled in, it looks like this. I'll leave it to cure overnight, but in the meantime I can combine the bits to form some kitbash Tau weaponry and support systems. It's nothing too fancy. As normal, you clean up your parts, but I do find that for this kind of creative discovery, dry fitting is essential to find what works or what you prefer. During this step, I make plenty of use of blue tack to help me figure things out. And once the rear support system is assembled, I leave it aside for the plastic glue to reach its max strength, and I move on to the weapons. For our Mushroom Man's right arm, I thought it would be cool to stack the rail rifles to create a really beefy looking weapon system, and then add in some extra bits for flavor. This cap seems to fit pretty well, and this drone sensor will help to make this weapon look marker light functional. I decided to use a bit of plastic rod to bind the two rail rifles together, which required only a tiny bit of embiggening to the existing holes. Then I attached that cap to cover up the open area on the bottom rail rifle. It's a small cosmetic accessory, but it's crucial to cover up those unfinished areas, and the fact it adds some interesting geometry is a great bonus. Then it's time for the top sensor, which starts by removing it from the existing drone part. While dry fitting this piece, I found it had less contact with the rail rifle than I would prefer, so I opted to pin it in place, and I did the same for that side antenna piece as well. Okay, so we're on to our last system. This one is the simpler of the two. The idea I have in mind is to use the bottom cylinder details of this part on the left for the bottom of this rail rifle, and then mount this shield dome looking piece on the side. And jumping ahead, here's how it looks. I left the top exposed as I figured it could get covered up during the green stuffing stage. After the green stuff has fully cured from step 1, it's time to assemble. You can see here I've already pinned our fungoid's weapons and rear support systems. The process is fairly straightforward. Start by drilling some holes for your parts, and glob up the pin with some super glue and fit it in place. The super glue gives you a quick window of working time to adjust the bends of the pin once inserted. That's when you make sure the pose is to your liking. Then I pin this guy to his base. I'm using a 50mm base because this Mushroom Man is going to proxy for a crisis suit. Then it's time to hide those pins with some green stuff. To be frank, I don't want to spend too much time going over the technique here. What I'm doing is essentially some crude green stuff work, trying to mimic the messy organic forms of this guy's body. It's the kind of texture that's very forgiving to imperfections, so I'm by no means trying to get a pristine finish. Here's the short of it. Wrap up those pins to make it easier to add further layers of green stuff. Super glue additional cable bits as desired. Add further green stuff to bulk up the arms. Blend the ends of our cable pieces into the body of our Mushroom Man. Roll up some tubes and connect them to create tendrils for added areas of interest. And we're done. My general attitude with green stuff sculpting is to treat it as an artistic exploratory process. Best not to worry about getting it perfect, because it does take skill, which develops through practice over time. Instead, aim for a result and enjoy the journey. The last part of the build is appropriating this base detail off of the base this model comes with. So I go at it with a plastic saw, And there it is. The build is complete. The target aesthetic I'm aiming for with the paint job is essentially in line with that of the target artwork. We're looking for drab organic earth tones, essentially grimdark alien auxiliary rather than cartoony toad.
Here we go!
As we normally do, we start with a layer of black primer. For our mushroom skin, I'm starting with a layer of Steel Legion drab, which I figured should provide a nice warm base color. This is followed by a layer of Rakarth flesh. And for the brightest values of our skin, I mix in some Flayed One flesh with the existing Rakarth flesh. And then I aim to hit this model from above to simulate zenithal lighting. Next we're moving on to the mushroom caps, starting with Wordbearer's Red. Now, this came out a bit strong. Perhaps I should have mixed in Wordbearer's Red to the ongoing skin blend, but it is what it is. To correct this, I'm aiming to tone down the red with a layer of Rakarth flesh, followed by a small splash of Cadian flesh tone. With the skin tones laid down, next is Poxwalker Shade, but I'm using it through the airbrush to tint the skin, to create a cool green pigmentation towards the lower half of the model, like the reference artwork. But that's it for the airbrushing steps. Next I want to put some base texture down using Vallejo's Earth Texture. I'm doing this now because it will take the texture a bit of time to dry enough so that it can take paint. So while it dries, I shift gears to the tech pieces. Starting with the black parts. I'm trying to follow the conventional coloration set by how Tau weapons are colored. Black for the innermost components, and the faction color for the outer components. But first, the metal bits. I'm using Vallejo's Metal Air Color Steel, and applying it over the various cables on the model. Then onto the reds, using a blend of Corn Red mixed with some Army Painter Pure Red. I should mention, this auxiliary mushroom man is from my buddy's Farside Enclave's army. He told me about this project he had in mind, and it just sounded like too much fun. I asked him if I could take a stab at it for a video, and here we are. Next I wanted to add a bit of brightness to some of the Tau tech bits, so I'm using model color Dark Sea Grey, but only on particular panels, as this is just a subtle accenting element. And I'm using Thalax Gold on those round gold Tau details you often see. Next is the wash step, and I'm using a bunch of washes all at once, and if they blend and intermingle, that's actually okay. I'm applying Reikland Flesh Shade on the body, Nuln Oil on all the inorganic components, Adrax Earth Shade on the Earth texture base, and Druchii Violet on the underneath of the mushroom caps. And after that, I did a bit of edge highlighting on the inorganic components, using Pure Red for our red armor pieces, and mixing a bit of Dark Sea Grey with black to edge highlight the black areas. At this stage, I was really beginning to like where things were heading, but the mushroom caps felt a bit too plain. I wanted to add something to make them more interesting, but nothing too loud, so I decided to take some Druchii Violet shade, and this odd sponge I had, and I just sort of sponged it on, trying to create a pattern which I hoped would read as organic. And in that regard, I think it was pretty successful. At this point we're nearly done. For a bit of added detail, I decided to add a blue glow on the weapon system sensor using the same basic concepts used in my eye lenses video. For now, I'm hitting it with Baharoth Blue, and I'll come back to it later with a bit of contrast. In the meantime, I'm doing a total dry brush. The base will be dry brushed aggressively with Steel Legion Drab, then a light dry brush of Screaming Skull over top, and the whole model will be dry brushed with Pallid Witch Flesh. First is the base. Steel Legion Drab goes a long way to add some warmth and richness to the earth texture, and the Screaming Skull does a good job of boosting the visual contrast of our basing scheme when applied lightly. Then our entire mushroom man gets a light dry brush of Pallid Witch Flesh. Top tips here. Use a soft application to build up the color slowly, as you don't want to overdo it and lose the readability of our lower layers. And use a circular motion, as that tends to be a good failsafe for an even application. With the dry brush done, I then hit the blue sensor with Frostheart contrast. And I add a few shrubs to the base, and we're essentially done. Just gotta let that PVA glue dry and rim the base black. And there you have it, a fungoid alien auxiliary of the Tau Empire, one which just so happens to serve as a decent crisis suit proxy as well. Quite convenient. As I mentioned in the opening, this was an unexpected project, but working with a very organic form, as well as the Tau parts, definitely allowed it to serve as a great palette cleanser. And I think looking at the target art, it turned out to be quite evocative in the end. As always, thank you to those on the Roll of Honor, Julius Maximus, as well as my other generous patrons and channel members. Anyways, there are buttons for liking, sharing, and subscribing, so press the buttons you want to press, and I'll catch you in the next one.